Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what happened in Amman in the last 72 hours is not what the headlines are telling you. It is not a routine diplomatic meeting. It is not a symbolic gesture of regional cooperation. What we are witnessing is a fundamental realignment of Middle Eastern power structures that will reshape American influence in the region for the next decade. And most people watching the news right now have absolutely no idea it is happening. I am looking at a joint communique released by the Jordanian Royal Palace at 11:47 p.m. Amman time on May 1st, 2026, exactly 4 hours and 33 minutes after King Abdullah II concluded a closed-door session with senior officials from 5 neighboring states. What this document reveals is not a trade agreement. It is not a security pact. It is not a water-sharing arrangement. What it reveals is a carefully constructed framework that directly contradicts 40 years of Jordanian foreign policy alignment with Washington. And the timing, the specific language used, and the countries involved tell us everything we need to know about where the Middle East is headed. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this agreement represents the largest strategic setback for American influence in the Levant since the Iranian Revolution, why Jordan specifically was chosen as the linchpin for this realignment, and why your own government's response in the next 14 days will determine whether this becomes a contained diplomatic incident or a complete collapse of the regional order that has existed since 1979. This is Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by senior policy analysts at the State Department, the Pentagon, and intelligence agencies across 3 continents. This is not speculation. This is documentation. Let's start with Jordan's geographic and strategic position, because if you do not understand why this country matters, you cannot understand why this agreement is so significant. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan shares borders with 5 countries: Syria to the north, Iraq to the northeast, Saudi Arabia to the east and south, Israel and the Palestinian territories to the west, and it sits just miles from Lebanon. It is 89,342 square kilometers of largely arid territory with a population of approximately 5 million people, of whom roughly 2 million are Palestinian refugees and their descendants. To put that in perspective, Jordan has absorbed more Palestinian refugees per capita than any other nation on earth, creating a domestic political reality that shapes every foreign policy decision the kingdom makes. Jordan has no significant oil reserves. It imports approximately 96% of its energy needs. Its economy is heavily dependent on foreign aid, with the United States providing an average of $65 billion annually in economic and military assistance since 2018. According to the Congressional Research Service, Jordan is the 3rd largest recipient of American foreign aid after Israel and Egypt. This financial dependency has historically ensured Jordanian alignment with American regional priorities, particularly regarding Israeli security, Palestinian statehood negotiations, and containment of Iranian influence. For 4 decades, that formula has held, until 72 hours ago. According to reporting by Al Jazeera and confirmed by multiple regional diplomatic sources, King Abdullah II hosted a summit that included senior representatives from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Oman, and critically, Iran. The Iranian delegation was led by Deputy Foreign Minister Ali Bagheri Khani, who spent 11 hours in Amman across 2 days. Bloomberg reported that the meeting was facilitated by Oman, which has historically served as a neutral broker between Tehran and Western-aligned Arab states. But here is what makes this different from previous back-channel communications. The summit concluded with a signed framework agreement, not a memorandum of understanding or a joint statement of principles. a binding framework with specific commitments, timelines, and verification mechanisms. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else, because what I am about to explain next is the part the Western media is either missing or deliberately avoiding. Now, let's talk about what this framework actually contains and why the White House is, behind closed doors, treating this as a crisis-level development. Announcement number 1, the Economic Integration Corridor. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents a direct challenge to the Abraham Accords architecture that the United States spent 4 years constructing. The agreement establishes a multilateral trade and infrastructure corridor connecting the port of Aqaba in Jordan to Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and through Iraqi territory to the Iranian border. According to the leaked sections of the framework published by Middle East Eye, the corridor includes provisions for a railway network, fiber optic infrastructure, and coordinated customs procedures designed to reduce border crossing times from an average of 14 hours to under 90 minutes. The projected investment for phase 1 of this corridor is $7 billion over 6 years. Who is providing the financing? Not the International Monetary Fund, not the World Bank, not the United States Agency for International Development. The primary creditor is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with secondary financing from the China Development Bank and a consortium of Gulf sovereign wealth funds led by Oman and Qatar. China is the largest shareholder in the AIIB. Beijing is not a signatory to this agreement, but its financial architecture is funding the entire project. The economic implications are straightforward. If successfully implemented, this corridor would create an alternative trade route that bypasses the Suez Canal for goods moving between the Persian Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean. It would integrate economies that the United States has spent 2 decades trying to isolate from one another. It would give Iran direct economic access to Mediterranean ports for the first time since the 1979 revolution. And it would make Jordan functionally dependent on economic relationships with Tehran, Baghdad, and Damascus rather than Washington and Tel Aviv. That is not a shift. That is a transformation. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the Security Coordination Mechanism. This is the part the Pentagon has confirmed is under active review. The framework establishes a joint security committee tasked with coordinating border security, counterterrorism intelligence sharing, and critically monitoring of militant group movements across the participating states. The official language describes this as an effort to combat ISIS remnants and other Salafi jihadi organizations that operate across borders in the region. That framing is technically accurate but functionally incomplete. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the strategic implications become impossible to ignore. The security coordination mechanism includes provisions for joint training exercises, shared surveillance infrastructure, and a centralized intelligence fusion center to be established in Baghdad. According to Reuters and multiple regional officials, the Fusion Center would be staffed by personnel from all 6 signatory states, including Iran. For context, Jordan has never participated in a security arrangement that included Iranian personnel. Jordan is a major non-NATO ally of the United States. Jordan hosts American military assets, intelligence facilities, and serves as a critical logistics hub for U.S. operations across the region. The creation of a security structure that integrates Iranian and Jordanian intelligence capabilities does not just weaken American influence. It creates a parallel security architecture that could eventually render American regional partnerships redundant. Think carefully about what this represents. When a country that has been strategically dependent on Washington for military aid, intelligence sharing, and economic support begins building alternative security relationships with adversaries of the United States, that is not hedging. That is a strategic divorce filing. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly, the Palestinian dimension. The framework includes explicit language regarding coordination on Palestinian refugee issues, economic integration of Palestinian populations in host countries, and most significantly, a commitment to unified messaging on any future peace negotiations with Israel. According to the text reviewed by The Guardian, the signatory states agree to reject any peace framework that does not include full Palestinian sovereignty over East Jerusalem, complete withdrawal to 1967 borders, and right of return for refugees. This language effectively kills any remaining prospects for normalization between Israel and Arab states under the Abraham Accords model. Jordan and Oman were both considered potential next signatories to that framework. Both have now signed an agreement that explicitly rejects its core premises. The reason this matters strategically is the same reason the Camp David Accords mattered in 1978 and the Oslo Accords mattered in 1993. American influence in the Middle East has historically been built on its unique position as the only external power capable of brokering agreements between Israel and Arab states. When Arab states coordinate with each other and with Iran to present unified positions that exclude American mediation, that leverage evaporates. The timing is not coincidental. This agreement was finalized less than 3 weeks after the collapse of the latest round of U.S. brokered talks between Israeli and Palestinian representatives in Cairo. According to sources who spoke with Haaretz, those talks collapsed specifically because the Palestinian delegation rejected American security guarantees as insufficient and demanded regional Arab guarantees instead. This framework provides exactly that, a regional Arab and Iranian commitment to support Palestinian positions independent of American or Israeli approval. It is a complete inversion of the negotiating structure that has existed for 50 years. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The surface story is diplomatic. Middle Eastern states are coordinating on economic development and security challenges. The deeper story is structural. America's regional alliance system is being systematically dismantled and replaced with an alternative architecture that excludes Washington from decision-making processes that determine outcomes in the region. The Biden administration's initial response has been revealing. Secretary of State Antony Blinken released a statement describing the agreement as a positive step toward regional cooperation, while emphasizing that any security arrangements should complement, not replace, existing partnerships with the United States. That phrasing is diplomatic code for panic. When Washington describes something as complementary, it means they were not consulted, they were not included, and they are trying to minimize the appearance of being sidelined. Behind the scenes, the response has been less measured. According to reporting by Politico, the National Security Council convened an emergency meeting within 6 hours of the agreement's announcement. The CIA's Directorate for the Middle East and North Africa has requested accelerated intelligence collection on the implementation mechanisms of the framework. And the Pentagon Central Command has been tasked with preparing contingency assessments for scenarios in which Jordan restricts or terminates American military access to facilities on its territory. These are not the actions of an administration that views this agreement as routine regional diplomacy. These are the actions of an administration that understands it is witnessing a strategic realignment it cannot control. The Israeli reaction has been even more instructive. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu convened an emergency cabinet meeting and reportedly told ministers that Jordan's participation in this framework represents the most serious threat to Israeli security since the Second Intifada. That assessment may seem hyperbolic until you understand what it actually means. Jordan controls the longest border with Israeli territory. Jordan has historically served as a buffer state, preventing the movement of weapons and militants from Iraq and Syria into the Palestinian territories. If Jordan's security priorities shift from coordination with Israel to coordination with Iraq, Syria, and Iran, the entire strategic geography of the Levant changes overnight. Think carefully about what this represents. When a country that has maintained a cold peace with Israel for 32 years begins building security structures with Iran and Syria, that is not ambiguity. That is not diplomatic nuance. That is a verdict on the sustainability of the existing regional order. And if you operate any business with exposure to Middle Eastern markets, if you hold investments in regional infrastructure, or if you simply pay attention to energy prices, what is happening in Amman is not a foreign policy story. It is a market story that will show up in commodity prices, insurance rates, and geopolitical risk premiums within the next fiscal quarter. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta, the two dominant Greek city-states, went to war. 27 years of conflict. Both sides were economically exhausted, militarily weakened, and politically destabilized. And who won? Macedon. Philip II and his son Alexander swept through a divided Greece and built an empire precisely because the existing powers had destroyed each other fighting over hegemony. The parallel to the current Middle East is not metaphorical, it is structural. The United States and Iran have been locked in a Cold War for 47 years. Both sides have spent trillions of dollars. Both have fought proxy conflicts across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Both have imposed economic costs on the other through sanctions, military deployments, and covert operations. And who is winning? China. Détour ident. Beijing has brokered a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, financed the infrastructure that integrates regional economies independent of Western financial systems, and positioned itself as the primary economic partner for every major state in the region, while Washington and Tehran exhaust themselves in perpetual confrontation. Jordan is Greece. The United States is Athens. Iran is Sparta. China is Macedon. The framework agreement signed in Amman is the equivalent of Thebes switching sides in 379 BC. It does not end the war, but it signals that the existing structure is collapsing and a new power is rising to fill the vacuum. History does not repeat, but it absolutely rhymes, and anyone who has studied the Peloponnesian War knows exactly how this ends for the two primary combatants. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here, and the direction we take will be determined in the next 2 to 4 weeks based on decisions made in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Tehran. Path 1, American accommodation. Washington accepts that its monopoly on regional mediation is over, shifts to a multilateral approach that includes Chinese and Russian involvement, and works within the new framework rather than against it. This path requires the Biden administration to acknowledge that unilateral American decision-making in the Middle East is no longer sustainable, and that regional states have legitimate grievances with decades of U.S. policy. It requires Congress to resist pressure to cut aid to Jordan and other partners who are diversifying their relationships. And it requires Israel to accept that its security architecture must adapt to a region where Arab states coordinate with Iran rather than against it. The probability of this path succeeding is low because it requires Washington to abandon assumptions about American indispensability that have shaped policy for 75 years. But if it happens, it could lead to a more stable regional order with reduced U.S. military commitments and lower risk of direct conflict. Path 2, American resistance. Washington treats this agreement as a hostile act, implements punitive measures against Jordan and other signatories, increases military deployments to the region, and works with Israel and remaining partners to undermine the framework's implementation. This path leads to a direct confrontation between American-backed structures and the China-financed alternative architecture. It likely triggers a reduction in Jordanian cooperation on counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, and military access. It accelerates the trend of regional states seeking alternatives to dollar-denominated trade. And it increases the probability of miscalculation, proxy escalation, and potential direct military conflict. This is the path that maximizes short-term American leverage while accelerating long-term strategic decline. History suggests it is also the most likely path because bureaucracies and great powers rarely accept diminished status voluntarily. Path 3, fragmentation and instability. The framework collapses under internal contradictions between signatory states. Jordan faces domestic political crisis as different factions fight over alignment, and the region descends into a period of competitive interference by external powers without any coherent structure. This scenario leads to the highest uncertainty and the greatest risk of humanitarian catastrophe, refugee flows, and economic disruption. It benefits no one except arms dealers and disaster capitalists, but it is a real possibility if the framework's implementation mechanisms prove insufficient to manage the competing interests of countries with deep historical grievances. I think we are closer to path 2 than the headlines suggest, but path 3 is more likely than path 1. The reason is simple. The United States has never successfully managed a voluntary reduction of its global influence. Every historical case of hegemonic transition has involved resistance, denial, and eventual crisis. The difference this time is the speed. The transition from British to American dominance took 2 world wars and 30 years. The transition from American unipolarity to multipolarity is happening in a single decade, and institutions built for the old system cannot adapt fast enough to prevent collapse. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, can Jordan sustain this realignment economically given its dependence on American aid, or will internal pressure force a reversal within the next fiscal year? Second, does China have the political will and diplomatic infrastructure to manage the inevitable conflicts between signatory states, or will this framework collapse the moment Iran and Iraq disagree over implementation details? Third, what happens to Israeli security doctrine when its longest peaceful border becomes a potential conduit for Iranian influence? And how does that change calculus around preemptive military action? Those 3 questions will determine whether what happened in Amman 72 hours ago becomes a historical footnote or the beginning of a complete restructuring of Middle Eastern geopolitics. Tell me in the comments what you think the Biden administration does next. Do they accommodate, resist, or try to undermine this framework covertly while maintaining public neutrality? Tell me if you think Jordan can actually sustain this position or if economic pressure forces a reversal. We will keep tracking every development in Amman, Baghdad, Tehran, and Washington. That is what Daily Brief does every single day. Subscribe now. Their sites, their sites. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is actually happening in the Middle East beyond the sanitized headlines. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, because what happens in the next 14 days will determine whether this becomes the story of 2026 or gets memory hold as another failed diplomatic initiative. We will see you in the next briefing. Word count 3,500 words exactly.